Millionaire pretended to be a poor worker to test his blind date, unexpectedly fell in love at first. Hi, my beautiful family. I speak to you today with a heart full of love, but also with truth. Our channel is built on your strength, your love, and your support. Every story I write is written with tears, with passion, and with prayer for each one of you. But my family, I see the channel going down because many forget to like, many forget to comment. It hurts me because it feels like my hard work is left unseen. I ask you today, not just as a creator, but as your brother who truly loves you, please, whenever you watch, give your love back. A simple like, a simple comment keeps this family alive, keeps our light shining, and gives me the power to bring you more and more beautiful stories. May God bless every woman in this family with honor, with dignity, and with unshakable strength. May every man be blessed with wisdom and respect. May our children rise higher than mountains, and may every home be filled with endless love and peace. Amen. If your heart is true, write present. If your love is real, write in the comment where you're watching from. You ever notice how people act differently when they think you have money? It's like a switch flips. Smiles get wider, patience stretches longer, and suddenly, your worth is tied to your bank balance. Daniel knew that better than anyone. And trust me, what he went through was less of a love story, and more of a crash course in how fast affection can turn into ambition. Flash forward with me for a second. Picture this. A crowded restaurant, soft lighting, glasses clinking. Daniel sits across from Sophie, the woman he thought might be different. He's nervous but hopeful, finally ready to tell her the truth. No greasy overalls, no cover story, just him. But the second those words leave his lips, "I'm not a mechanic. I own the company," her smile changes. Not wider, colder, like she's just spotted a prize she's been waiting to collect. That moment? That's when Daniel realized the date wasn't about love anymore. It was about leverage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind. Daniel was 32, a self-made millionaire who had clawed his way out of nothing. No silver spoons, no family trust fund, just grit, late nights, and enough failures to make anyone else quit. On paper, he had it all: companies in his name, a car collection that would make any gearhead drool, and a penthouse that practically touched the skyline. But behind the glossy numbers, he was tired. Every date felt like déjà vu. Women leaning in close, but always asking the same question. So, what do you do? It wasn't curiosity. It was currency. So, Daniel did something drastic. He built himself a disguise. No Rolex, no Armani, just a pair of scuffed boots, a beat-up truck, and a story about being a mechanic. And when he matched with Sophie, it felt different. She was funny, sharp, easy to talk to. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself laughing without second-guessing. And here's the thing: you never expect to fall for someone when you're lying about who you are. But Daniel did. Hard. Now, before you start thinking this is some cheesy rom-com setup where the truth sets you free, let me stop you. This isn't that. Because the truth, it didn't set anyone free. It caged Daniel in the ugliest kind of realization. Sophie wasn't falling in love with him. She was falling in love with the life she thought she could cash in on. And that's why this story isn't just about romance. It's about masks, manipulation, and what happens when the line between love and greed snaps clean into .so. Buckle in. Because Daniel's story isn't just a date gone wrong, it's the kind of revenge tale that proves sometimes the sweetest justice comes served cold. Hey, if you love stories where justice isn't just served, it's chilled and plated with silver, please hit subscribe. These videos take hours of writing, editing, and emotional recovery from secondhand rage, so your support seriously means the world. Daniel had everything people usually dream about: a name on the Forbes list, a fleet of cars most collectors could only fantasize about, a skyline view from a penthouse he barely slept in. On paper, he was the kind of man people called lucky, but behind closed doors, he was exhausted. See, Daniel hadn't started rich. He'd grown up in a cramped bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a mother who juggled 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Every dollar he had now was the result of grit, late nights, and more failures than he cared to count. And maybe that's why the attention he got as a millionaire felt so hollow. But because here's the truth, Daniel didn't want admiration for his bank account. He wanted connection, but every date ended the same. Women leaning forward, eyes wide. The moment he dropped the word company, compliments flowed like honey. Until the bill came, then it was expected he'd cover everything. Not just dinner, their rent, their designer bags, their entire lifestyle. Daniel wasn't naive, he knew money attracted people. But what ate at him was the thought that no one actually saw him anymore. He wasn't Daniel, the man who loved old movies and greasy burgers. He was Daniel, the walking wallet. So one night, staring at the glittering city below, he made a choice. A risky one. If money was a filter, he'd strip it away. He'd show up as the man he used to be, a mechanic in oil-stained jeans, driving a truck that coughed more than it roared. No Rolex, no penthouse backdrops, just him. And that's how Sophie entered the picture. They matched on a dating app, one Daniel had signed up for under his new, ordinary profile. Sophie wasn't the type to use 1,000 filters or pose next to yachts that weren't hers. Her photos were casual jeans, messy bun, holding a cup of coffee like it was her lifeline. Her bio? Dry humor and a love of indie music. Refreshing. Their messages flowed easily. No awkward pauses, no endless small talk about careers or net worth. She joked about her terrible cooking. He admitted he couldn't dance to save his life. It felt real. The night of their blind date, Daniel almost forgot about the test. He pulled up in that beat-up truck, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked into the cafe they'd agreed on. Sophie was already there, scrolling on her phone. When she looked up, she smiled an actual smile, not the calculated kind he'd grown used to. "Daniel?" she asked. "Yeah, Sophie? Finally. I was starting to think you'd bailed." The banter picked up instantly. She teased him for ordering black coffee like a grumpy old man. He laughed when she admitted she'd spilled her last 3 cups that week. And somewhere between their jokes and the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. He leaned back, watching her talk about her day, and thought, maybe I don't need to keep testing her. Maybe she's different. Of course, the irony was brutal. He'd built this whole disguise to protect himself, and here he was, lowering his guard after 1 hour with her. But that's the thing about loneliness, it doesn't just fade. It waits. It waits for the first spark, the first person who makes you forget the walls you built. And Sophie? She lit that spark without even trying. Now, don't get me wrong, not saying Daniel was naive enough to think he'd found the one after a single date. But for the first time in years, he left a cafe feeling lighter. He wasn't thinking about prenups or bank accounts or gold diggers. He was thinking about Sophie's laugh echoing in his ears, and the possibility, just the possibility that someone might finally like him for him. Would you ever pretend to be someone else just to see people's true intentions? Honest answers only. Daniel and Sophie fell into a rhythm that felt effortless. Coffee runs that stretched into hours, sidewalk strolls where their shadows merged under streetlights, and those late-night calls that ended with laughter echoing through the phone like it was music. For the first time, Daniel felt like he wasn't performing, like he wasn't the sum of his wealth or accomplishments. He could just be. One evening, they were sitting on a park bench, the kind that squeaks under your weight, sharing fries from a paper bag. Sophie laughed at a story about Daniel's attempt to fix his neighbor's squeaky door hinge. "You're hopeless," she said, nudging him playfully. But Daniel couldn't help the pang that hit him. If she knew the truth, would she still find me hopelessly endearing? That question shadowed every interaction. When she mentioned dating apps, Daniel felt a twinge of panic. She'd say things like, "Sometimes I wonder what people hide online." Makes you question if anyone's real, doesn't it? Casual, light, but heavy enough to make him squirm. He laughed along, but inside, a storm was brewing. Daniel tried to tell himself it was just nerves. He wasn't lying maliciously. He was testing her, right? Still, the longer they spent together, the harder it became to keep up the facade. He wanted to tell her everything: the company, the cars, the penthouse, but fear held him hostage. Fear that all the magic, all the laughter, would vanish the moment the truth came out. And Sophie? She wasn't predictable either. She'd drop hints now and then, teasing him with phrases that made Daniel second-guess everything. "You're a man of many talents," she said one evening, tilting her head. "I bet you have secrets I'd never guess." Innocent enough on the surface. But Daniel felt the trap snap tighter around him. Was she genuinely curious, or just testing him in her own way? The tension wasn't constant. It came in waves. During a late-night movie marathon at her apartment, he'd forget the test entirely, catching himself mid-laugh, thinking, me she really does like me. Then, seconds later, she'd ask something innocuous like, "What do you usually do on weekends?" And Daniel's heart would tighten because every answer had to be measured, every truth masked. They began sharing stories of their pasts, little confessions that usually bind people together. Sophie talked about growing up with two younger siblings, the chaos of breakfast mornings, and the quiet pride she felt when she finally got her first paycheck. Daniel spoke sparingly, careful to paint a picture of a modest life. But every laugh, every connection, made the deceit heavier. Sometimes, he wondered if Sophie could sense it, the weight of the lie pressing down on him. He caught himself staring at her when she wasn't looking, memorizing the curve of her smile, the way her hair fell into her eyes, the subtle crease when she was concentrating. "Do you like me for me? Or do you like me for the story I've fabricated?" There were nights he'd lie awake, the ceiling fan casting shadows on the walls, replaying every joke, every glance. He wondered if he should confess, even just a little. But every time, the thought of ruining the spark made him swallow the words. Silence became his shield, and yet, the strange showed. In small ways. A pause before replying to a text, a flicker in his smile, little signs that he was living on borrowed honesty. Sophie noticed them sometimes. "You seem quiet tonight," she said once, voice soft, teasing, but with an edge that Daniel couldn't ignore. "Something on your mind?" He laughed it off. "Just tired." But the truth was heavier than any lie he'd told in business or in life. Because this time, it wasn't contracts or deals. This was someone's heart he was dancing around, and he wasn't sure if he was leading or just stumbling in the dark. Despite it all, hope persisted. Every genuine smile from Sophie, every laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes, gave him reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, honesty wasn't the only way forward. The risk felt worth it, almost. And that's the dangerous thing about secrets, they make moments sweeter, but they make the fall sharper. So, have to ask you, if you were in Daniel's shoes, would you have told her the truth? Or is it okay to hide the truth if your intentions are good? Or is that still deception? Because in Daniel's story, the line between honesty and survival was razor thin, and he was walking it blindfolded. Daniel had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. The words, the tone, even the pause before he said them. "Sophie, I need to tell you something." He imagined it would be awkward, yes, but also honest. Perhaps liberating. Maybe, just maybe, it would make her like him even more, him, the man behind the bank statements. But reality has a way of hitting harder than rehearsal ever does. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every lie he'd carried, every carefully chosen phrase, every laugh that had disguised the truth. "I'm not the guy I've been pretending to be," he began. "I'm not a mechanic. I don't live in a small apartment. I own the company I told you about in passing." Sophie's eyes widened. There was a pause, a tilt of her head, the kind you give when curiosity mixes with calculation. Daniel held his breath, waiting for disappointment, confusion, maybe even a small laugh. Anything but what came next. She smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. Not the playful spark from the park bench, not the laugh that had made him feel seen. It was sharper, precise, almost hungry. "You're a millionaire?" she asked, voice almost too calm, too measured. "Yes," Daniel admitted, voice tight. "I wanted to be sure. I wanted to see if you liked me for me, not what I have." Her response didn't include hesitation. It didn't include warmth. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, gleaming. "Well," she said, tapping the table. I guess that explains a lot. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. That's not a good sign. She smiled again. And this time, it felt predatory. The subtle calculation behind her words, the way she asked questions now with an almost clinical curiosity, it hit him like a punch. Every joke they'd shared, every late-night call, suddenly felt like lines in a play, and he was the unwitting actor. Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to reach across the table, shake some sense into her, demand no, plead for the girl who had laughed at his jokes to be real. But what he saw was something he couldn't unsee. That gleam in her eyes wasn't affection. It was opportunity. He remembered the little things now. The casual mentions of her own financial struggles. The stories she told about always wanting a comfortable life. The sly compliments whenever he hinted at his future plans. Things he had brushed off, thinking they were just personality quirks. Now, they were pieces of a puzzle that made a chilling picture. Daniel leaned back, suddenly aware of the distance that had always existed between them. Even in moments of intimacy, Sophie was no longer the woman he had laughed with. She was a mirror reflecting what she wanted from him: status, stability, access. His stomach twisted. A part of him wanted to argue, to plead, to tell her he was still the same man beneath the wealth, but what would that even accomplish? The trust was gone. The connection he had believed in was a fabrication. And worst of all, he had played himself, thinking he was discovering authenticity, when he was being tested, subtly and ruthlessly. In return, that was the moment Daniel realized. Ellie's voice tightens with a pause. Letting the weight sink in, Sophie never fell for him. She fell for his money. It hurt in a way words rarely capture. Not betrayal of romance alone, it was a betrayal of belief. Belief in another person, belief in human decency, and most painfully, belief in himself. He wanted to disappear right there, to vanish into the city lights, and pretend this had all been a fever dream. But he couldn't. He had to sit there, to process it. To understand that sometimes the people we think we see clearly are actually shadows shaped by what they want, not who they are. Sophie reached across the table, lightly brushing his hand as she said something about celebrating new opportunities together. And Daniel's mind snapped. Not in anger, not yet, just clarity. The mask was off, and for the first time, he could see her for what she really was. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her words hung in the air, and in the silence, Daniel's heartbreak found its clarity. He wasn't losing her to another man. He was losing her to greed, and she had been playing the part perfectly from the start. So I'll ask you this, because it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. What would you do if someone only loved the version of you with money? Because in Daniel's story, this wasn't about romance anymore. It was about being used, and sometimes realizing that truth is the first step toward the revenge you didn't even know you'd start planning. After that night, Daniel didn't spiral. He didn't scream. He didn't throw himself into some reckless attempt at closure. Instead, he sat in his penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across his floor, and he made a decision. This wasn't about anger. Not really. It was about clarity. About showing the world, and Sophie in particular, what happens when greed meets precision. He started small. Nothing flashy. Just little truths planted in the right places. A comment here on a social media thread. A subtle mention in a conversation with a mutual acquaintance. Nothing that screamed revenge, just breadcrumbs. Enough to make people start noticing inconsistencies. Daniel was careful. Precision was key. This wasn't about humiliation for its own sake. It was about revealing reality. Sophie had built a faade, a story where she was charming, relatable, someone who deserved admiration. But Daniel had the receipts, financial threads, messages, invitations she had accepted purely because she knew he could afford them, and he knew how to let those threads unravel without touching them directly. Timing became his secret weapon. He'd invite her to events where the wrong person would overhear the right detail. A casual mention to a business contact who happened to be a mutual friend. Social media posts timed just so, revealing the luxurious dinners and gifts she'd taken for granted. It was like watching dominoes fall, silently and in perfect sequence. Daniel watched her carefully. He never confronted her outright, not yet. That would have been reactive, messy. Instead, he let the pattern emerge on its own. People began asking questions. Friends started sharing stories that didn't match the Sophie they thought they knew. And Sophie, confident as she was, didn't notice the slow crack forming around her. He even brought in subtle irony. Invitations to gatherings with friends who were savvy enough to see the signs, but not enough to call it directly. Gifts left with intentional oversights. A small nudge here, a casual hint there. Nothing could touch her if she stayed careful, but even the most careful people eventually slip. And she did. It started with the dinner party. Sophie, radiant and composed, leaned into her role, laughing at jokes, toasting to success, playing the part of the gracious, charming partner. But Daniel had already seeded the room with questions. A friend casually asked about a recent investment opportunity Sophie had mentioned. Another inquired about a trip she had supposedly planned independently. Her answers stumbled, just slightly. Hesitation, a shift in posture, tiny cracks, invisible to most, but not to the right eyes. He watched, quietly, from across the room, heart steady. No thrill seeking here, just clarity. Every misstep, every contradiction, was like a brushstroke revealing the true picture. Sophie wasn't genuine. She had never been. It didn't take long for whispers to spread. People started to pull pieces together. The same friends who had once praised her charm now raised eyebrows. Social media posts she had curated so carefully began to look staged, rehearsed. The narrative she had built around herself started to fray at the edges. And Daniel? He didn't intervene. He simply let the truth speak. He'd always believed that the most devastating revelation isn't when someone is called out, it's when they realize the world has seen the cracks before they ever notice themselves. But he didn't stop there. Daniel understood that exposure without consequence isn't enough. He leveraged his network with subtle brilliance. A whispered note here, a mention there, about the patterns of behavior she had displayed when she believed no one was watching. It wasn't about revenge, it was about teaching accountability in a language she understood. Reality. She began to notice it eventually. The stares, the murmurs, the polite but pointed questions. Invitations she had assumed would come freely began to dwindle. She texted Daniel once, almost as a test. "Why is everyone looking at me like that?" He replied, calmly, "Funny how the truth does that. No venom, no gloating, just a quiet, cutting clarity that landed harder than any angry confrontation could." The brilliance of the plan wasn't just in public exposure, it was in subtlety. Daniel had learned from experience that the best revenge isn't loud. It doesn't scream or rage. It's meticulous, methodical, and slow burning. By the time Sophie realized the web had been woven around her, the damage was complete, and she had no one to blame but herself. It was almost poetic. The woman who had thrived on appearances and manipulation now found herself navigating a world that no longer afforded her the benefit of doubt. Every social interaction became a test, every smile scrutinized. And Daniel? He watched from a distance, satisfied not with malice, but with justice delivered with finesse. Even now, months later, he could replay the moment she finally understood. The slight hesitation when she approached a friend. The carefully practiced smile faltering mid-conversation. That brief flicker of panic in her eyes. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't need to be. That subtle recognition, that realization that the person she had underestimated had orchestrated a revelation, was sharper than any confrontation could ever be. And there was a lesson in all of this. A quiet one, wrapped in dignity. Precision beats pettiness. Clarity beats anger. Revenge, when executed with calm intent, doesn't just punish, it enlightens. So I have to ask you, what's your favorite story of someone getting exposed for who they really are? The ones that leave you thinking, wow, they deserve that, or maybe, I wish I'd been that clever. Because in Daniel's story, the master plan wasn't flashy, it wasn't immediate, but when it landed perfectly. And Sophie learned, the hard way, that you can't manipulate the world without leaving fingerprints, and someone's watching for them. It started small, almost imperceptible. A raised eyebrow here, a quiet question there. Sophie, who had always moved through rooms like she owned them, suddenly felt eyes on her in ways that made her skin crawl. Friends she had counted on for loyalty hesitated before sharing plans. Casual invitations became vague, and the once effortless charm she relied on started to feel brittle. Daniel didn't need to intervene. He didn't need to send another message or make another phone call. He had done his part. The breadcrumbs were already scattered, and now the avalanche was self-propelled. Every decision Sophie had made, every calculated word she had spoken, was unraveling in real time. It was fascinating, in a cold way. Watching someone's carefully constructed narrative collapse under its own weight is a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. She wasn't evil, just opportunistic. And when opportunity is mistaken for affection, the fallout can be brutal. Sophie tried to maintain control. She posted pictures online, dinners with friends, trips to places that looked impressive but hollow. She smiled for cameras, laughed at jokes she didn't find funny, but it wasn't enough. Subtle comments from acquaintances, offhand mentions of inconsistencies, began to pierce the bubble she had so meticulously built. The public Sophie, the poised, charming figure, was slowly being exposed as an act, and then came the whispers. Not loud accusations, but tiny murmurs that grow louder in closed circles. "Did you see how she reacted when Daniel mentioned the investment?" someone asked. "I thought she had her own job. Why was she so focused on his wealth?" The words weren't venomous, they didn't need to be. They were seeds, and they took root fast. Her private life, the side she thought no one saw, collided with the public persona she had cultivated. Texts that weren't meant for anyone's eyes were noticed. Messages that seemed innocuous to her became evidence of intent. Sophie's reactions, once calculated, now came across as defensive and frantic. At first, she tried to laugh it off with Daniel. "You've made it seem like everyone's against me," she said, voice tight. Daniel simply raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe you just made it too easy for them to see who you are." That one line, simple as it was, hit harder than any argument could. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. His calm, measured observation was enough to leave Sophie off balance, and that imbalance spread everywhere she went. Doors started closing. Invitations dried up. People who once sought her company now found excuses, subtle but firm. Business contacts she had hoped to impress no longer returned messages. And casual friends began sharing what they had noticed: small inconsistencies, strange patterns, and moments of opportunism Sophie thought she had hidden well. Even her own reflection became unrecognizable. The confident, poised woman who had walked into Daniel's life was now a mosaic of contradictions. Each smile felt rehearsed, every joke forced. And in quiet moments, when no one was watching, Sophie felt the weight of her own construction pressing down, suffocating her. Daniel observed it all from a distance, but not without empathy. This wasn't just about exposure, it was about realization. Sometimes, the most effective justice isn't about punishment, it's about letting the consequences of choices speak louder than any words could. And Sophie's choices, over months of charm and calculation, were now delivering a reckoning she couldn't deny. She reached out one last time. A message pinged on Daniel's phone. "Can we talk? I can explain." Daniel stared at it, feeling neither triumph nor vengeance, just clarity. The story was unfolding perfectly. She had been given every opportunity to show her true intentions, and now the truth was visible to everyone, including herself. He didn't reply immediately. There was no need. Exposure had done the work. The ripple effects of her actions, her own network slowly aligning against the illusions she had created, were enough. Silence became a tool sharper than any confrontation. And so, Sophie navigated her days in a world that had shifted around her. She smiled, but the confidence was gone. She laughed, but the authenticity had fled. Every interaction became a mirror reflecting choices she couldn't take back. Daniel didn't need to lift a finger. The house of cards she had built was collapsing on its own. And through it all, Daniel remained unshaken. He didn't seek revenge in a fit of emotion. He didn't craft elaborate schemes to humiliate. He had relied on one principle: precision beats pettiness. The natural consequences of Sophie's actions, combined with subtle nudges of reality, were devastating enough. So here's the question for you. Because this is where stories get messy. In the best way, do you think Daniel should give her one last chance? Or let her drown in her own lies? Because in this story, sometimes the quietest acts, the ones that let truth do the talking, are the ones that hit the hardest. Weeks passed, and Daniel's life continued its rhythm, calm, deliberate, untouched by the chaos Sophie had expected him to create. He had watched her unravel from a distance, yes, but now a new chapter began. The begging, the letters, the texts, the calls. Sophie's words arrived like little punches, each one dripping with desperation. Daniel, I can explain. Please don't do this to me. I promise. I'm different now. Neither. I made a mistake. I see it clearly. Can we start over? Each message was carefully crafted, emotional, urgent. She thought pleading could rewrite the story she had written so carelessly. He read them, every single one, and then, nothing. Not out of cruelty. Not out of some petty desire for vengeance. Daniel had evolved past the need for confrontation. He didn't want to humiliate her further. He didn't need the drama. The lesson had already been learned. He had grown beyond the person who once measured love by the attention it received or the wealth it demanded. Silence became his tool. And oh, the quiet power of silence. It's underrated, isn't it? Words have weight, but no words? That leaves room for reflection. That leaves room for realization. Each unread message, each unreturned call, became a mirror showing Sophie exactly what her choices had cost her. He imagined her reading one of his silent refusals, the one that wasn't even written, the one that said, "You can beg, you can explain, you can promise, but I am not here anymore." Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge. And Daniel wielded it effortlessly. Sophie's frantic messages began to slow, then stop altogether. The charm, the laughter, the easy facade vanished under the weight of consequences she couldn't escape. She wasn't humiliated in front of a crowd, shouted at, or publicly exposed in a scene of rage. No, this was subtler, cleaner, and far more piercing. It was absence. It was absence that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Daniel walked through his days with a quiet confidence. Meetings, calls, laughter with friends, all untouched by the drama he had been dragged into before. He felt a strange satisfaction, but not a cruel one. It wasn't about winning. It was about living beyond her manipulation. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He just existed, unshaken, steady. And in that steadiness, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, the most devastating impact isn't shouting from the rooftops. It's a calm refusal to engage, to let the world, and the person who underestimated you, witness your composure. He reflected on the irony. The woman who had sought to exploit his life had unintentionally taught him the ultimate lesson. Boundaries are power. Detachment is strength. And silence? Well, silence was more eloquent than any words he could have hurled in anger. Days turned into weeks. Sophie's messages dwindled, then stopped entirely. She had no platform left to leverage, no charm left to manipulate. And Daniel? He didn't check for them. He didn't wonder. He had learned that self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't need validation. It simply exists. In that quiet, Daniel's world felt lighter, free, and the story, the betrayal, the manipulation, it all became a backdrop for something far more satisfying than revenge. Growth. He didn't need a response. He didn't need acknowledgement. He had already moved past the need for answers. Because sometimes, the most powerful answer is the one you never give. And so, as the city hummed outside his penthouse window, Daniel realized that letting someone fall short on their own terms, not with force, not with anger, but with silence, was the cleanest, sharpest justice of all. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge. Time has a way of smoothing edges. Months passed, and Daniel's life settled into a rhythm that felt almost serene. Sophie's facade was gone, doors closed, whispers faded. The people who had once admired her cautious, now seeing her for what she was. The fallout had done its work. The world had quietly corrected itself. Daniel, meanwhile, didn't just survive. He thrived. Not in headlines or flashy announcements, but in that rare, quiet sense of peace you can only get when you've let go of the weight of deception. His mornings were unhurried, his evenings filled with conversations that mattered, laughter that wasn't forced. Wealth still surrounded him, sure, but it was no longer a shield or a test. It was just life. And then, unexpectedly, there were people, friends, colleagues, new faces, and even some old ones who had seen the drama unfold, people who sought him not for what he had, but for who he was. That was the most refreshing revelation of all. Connection without calculation, curiosity without expectation. For the first time in years, Daniel felt seen not as a millionaire, not as a prize, but as a person. One afternoon, he found himself at a local cafe, waiting for someone new to join him. The chatter of coffee machines, the clatter of mugs on saucers, the hum of conversations, it was ordinary, but it felt extraordinary. He glanced up, and there she was, a kind, unassuming woman, with eyes that seemed to look right into him, not through him. No games, no agendas, just presence. They talked for hours. Not about wealth, not about status, not about tests or facades. Just stories, laughter, small confessions, and shared quirks. And Daniel realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. Real hope. The kind that doesn't hinge on conditions or hidden motives. He remembered the early days with Sophie, the excitement, the spark, the late-night talks that had felt like magic. And he smiled, not out of regret, but out of gratitude. Those moments had taught him clarity, boundaries, the importance of authenticity. They had shown him that sometimes the people we think we want aren't the people we need. Life, he discovered, didn't need theatrics to be meaningful. Joy wasn't measured in attention or admiration. And love? Real love wasn't about the glint of gold or the shine of a bank account. It was in laughter shared without pretense, in support given freely, in trust built on honesty. Daniel's reflection on the past didn't bring bitterness, it brought wisdom. He had tested, observed, and ultimately learned that the heart recognizes authenticity, even when the mind doubts it. And in Sophie's unraveling, in her exposure and the quiet fallout, he found confirmation of a principle he had long known, but rarely lived. The truth eventually surfaces, whether by design or by consequence. He looked out the cafe window, sunlight streaming across the table, glinting on the rims of coffee cups. The city moved around him, busy and unbothered, and he felt free. Free to pursue relationships where honesty mattered. Free to enjoy his achievements without suspicion. Free to be himself, fully and unapologetically. And as the conversation with his new companion flowed easily, he realized that life had handed him a gift far more valuable than wealth. The chance to connect, genuinely, with someone who saw him, not his money, not his status, but his character. Pause for reflection. True love isn't about what's in your wallet, it's about what's in your heart. Daniel finally understood. The sparks, the heartbreak, the lessons, they had all led to this. A life measured not in gold or luxuries, but in trust, laughter, and genuine connection. And in that realization, he felt a quiet joy that no betrayal, no deception, and no test could ever take away. He smiled, a full, unguarded smile. The past was behind him. The lessons were learned. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel looked forward, not with caution or calculation, but with open, hopeful anticipation. Because some stories aren't about revenge alone. They're about growth, redemption, and the extraordinary peace that comes from finally finding the people who love you for exactly who you are. Daniel didn't just walk away from Sophie, he stepped into a version of himself he hadn't fully realized existed. Confident, composed, and unshaken by the drama that once consumed him. He refused to let bitterness define him. He had learned something crucial. The sharpest revenge isn't about humiliation or public spectacle, it's about reclaiming your life, your peace, and your dignity. Sometimes, the hardest victories are the quietest. Daniel didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. He simply thrived in the life he had carefully built for himself, surrounded by people who valued him for who he was, not for what he owned. That was the real triumph, the one no one could take away. no matter how clever or manipulative someone else tried to be. And there's a lesson here for all of us. Life has a way of testing trust, loyalty, and character, but healing, clarity, and self-respect, they endure. Daniel's story reminds us that letting go, moving on, and living authentically can be more satisfying than any act of revenge. So, if you found this story as cathartic as I did, please hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe. These videos take hours to research, write, and bring to life, and your support means we can keep telling these stories. Remember, the greatest power isn't in proving someone wrong. It's in proving yourself right by living well, thriving authentically, and never letting deceit define your path.